pub. Doubts were beginning to emerge. At midnight, when the year turned, there were fireworks going up from the towns beyond the valley, but they were too far off for the sound to carry, and no one came out to watch. The dance at the village hall was cancelled, and although the Gladstone was full, there was no mood for celebration. Tony closed the bar at hour, and everyone made their way home. Only the police stayed out in the streets, gathered around their vans, or heading back into the hills. In the morning, the rain started up once again. Water coursed from the swollen peat beds quickly through the cloughs and down the stepped paths which fell from the edge of the moor. The river thickened with silt from the hills and plumed across the weirs. On the moor there were flags marking where the parents said they'd walked. The flags furled and snapped in the wind. At the visitor centre, television trucks filled the car park and journalists started to gather. In the village hall, the trestle tables were laid with green cups and saucers, the urns rising to the boil and the smell of bacon cobs drifting out into the rain. At the Hunter place, there were voices coming from the barn conversion where the parents were staying, loud enough that the policeman outside could hear. Jess Hunter came over from the main house with a mug of tea. A helicopter flew in from the reservoirs, banking slowly along the river and passing over the weir and the quarry and the woods. The divers were going through the river again. A group of journalists waited for the shot, standing behind a cordon by the Packhorse Bridge, cameras aimed at the empty stretch of water, the breath clouding over their heads. In the lower field, 2 of Jackson's boys were kneeling beside a fallen ewe. There was a racket of camera shutters as the first diver appeared, the wet-suited head sleek and slow through the water. A second diver came round the bend, and a third. They took turns ducking through the arch in the bridge, and then they were out of sight. The camera crews jerked their cameras from the tripods and began folding everything away. One of the Jackson boys bucked a quad bike across the field and told the journalists to move. The river ran empty and quick. The cement works was shut down to allow for a search. In a week, the first snowdrops emerged along the verges past the cricket ground, while it seemed winter had yet a way to go. At the school in the staff room, the teachers kept their coats on and waited. Everything that might be said seemed like the wrong thing to say. The heating pipes made a rattling noise that most of them were used to, and the mood in the room unstiffened. Miss Dale asked Miss French if her mother was any better, and Miss French outlined the ways in which she was not. There was a silence again in the room and the tapping of the radiator. Mrs. Simpson came in and thanked them for the early start. They all said of course it wasn't a problem, under the circumstances. Mrs. Simpson said the plan was to follow their lessons as normal, but be ready to talk about the situation if the children asked, which it seemed likely they would. There was a knock at the door, and Jones the caretaker stepped in to say the heating would be working soon. Mrs. Simpson asked him to make sure the yard was gritted. He gave her a look which suggested there'd be no need to ask. When the children were brought to school, Mrs. Simpson stood at the gate to welcome them. The parents lingered once the children had gone inside, watching the doors being locked. Some of them looked as though they could stand there all day. At the bus stop, the older children waited for the bus to the secondary school in town. They were teenagers now. It was the first day back, but they weren't saying much. It was cold, and they had hoods pulled tightly over their heads. All day they would be asked about the missing girl, as if they knew anything more than they'd heard on the news. Lindsay Smith said it was a safe bet Miss Bowman would ask if they needed to chat. She did finger quotes around the word chat. Deepak said at least it would be a way of getting out of French. Sophie looked away and saw Andrew waiting at the other bus stop with Irene, his mother. He was the same age as they were, but he went to a special school. Their bus pulled up, and James warned Liam not to make up any bullshit about Becky Shaw. It snowed, and the snow settled thickly. There was a service at the church.